Welcome to Antarctica Did That For Me. We're a podcast for everyday people with a little adventure in their hearts. We're Keri and Cassa, and we've spent huge chunks of our time living and working in Antarctica. Welcome to a journey that changed our lives. We hope it will change yours too.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Antarctica Did That For Me. I am one of your co-hosts. I'm Cassa Grant. I'm here with the wonderful Keri Nelson.
Hey, everyone.
And today's episode is all about leadership lessons from Antarctica. And this is where I love to geek out. But I learned a lot about leadership during my time on the ice. And
There's a lot to learn.
There is a lot to learn of what to do and what not to do. And leadership, even if it's literally just leading yourself, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that is. But leadership in itself can also be an adventure if you really want to look at that way. I work with a lot of clients right now who are developing their leadership capabilities, and it's a challenge, So looking at it as an adventure can actually, it's a very dorky way to look at it, but it can actually really help people get better at the thing that they're doing.
I mean, it's such an important thing. The whole mission of Antarctica sort of turns on whether or not people who are the right people are in positions kind of leading that mission. So I really like the subject too.
Yeah, and it's not just the right people, it's also people who are able to learn the right skills in order to be in that position, if that makes sense. I don't think there's actually any kind of such thing as a natural born leader, but I do think that there are ways to build those capabilities. And I saw that a lot on the ice, actually. And so that's what we're going to talk about. I had mentioned earlier, Keri, that I saw you as a leader on the ice. And you had that exact reaction where you laughed.
I think that's funny. I haven't really had many named big leadership jobs on ice, but I have probably a strong and noticeable personality. So in that way, I hope too many people didn't follow me off a cliff.
No, I think that was a really good point about it, though, because you can have these positional leadership ideas of the big boss in charge. And then you can have people who are the day-to-day leaders or the people who are showing up with a good example. And, especially when you were running the store, which is my experience with you, was how you showed up in that store really led the tone of the store and really led the expectation of when people walked into the store.
Oh, thanks, Cassa. That's really a nice thing to say. I mean, I think you're right in that there are both the named title leaders in our organization, and then there are people who are just kind of in the community that are seen as leaders. And it takes both kinds of people, sort of, I don't know what you would call that kind of leader, but it takes both of those kinds of leadership positions to kind of keep a mission off on a strong footing. Luckily, I think we've run into both of those kinds of people while we've been in Antarctica. We were talking a little bit about, how we wanted to go about this episode in the first place. And you had an example of someone who had showed you really good leadership. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of examples, but the one that came to mind from a kind of a higher leadership perspective was we had a new station manager I can't remember exactly which season it was for me, but he was really honest with us. And we're going to talk about this more, but every single season has its challenges. Every single season has things go wrong that we all have to deal with. He was the first one that I had experienced in that kind of level of leadership who was straight up and was like, look, he wasn't like, oh, I don't know, I throw up my hands, but he was like, here's what I can share with you. I don't know about this thing, but here's what I can share and give you context around that. And I just remember respecting him so much for that, because it wasn't that I had never experienced leadership of that kind before, but he was really doing it from a very clear place at a very high level of leadership. And it really stuck with me. I really respected it a lot.
Why do you think that stuck with you so much? What do you think that the effect of that kind of open honesty on you, on your work crew was when he was doing that? Because there's another way of just kind of keeping what's going on close to the chest, just giving people what they need to know, not all of the information. Maybe there are some benefits to that as a leader. So why do you think that the way this leader approached things was so well received by you and the people you worked with?
Part of it is because you're always going to have discernment as a leader when you're deciding what you're going to share with people and what is not appropriate, because it's going to either create panic or they won't understand the context, or it's just too much information, right? So what I respected about that and what really stuck with me about that was that he was treating us like adults because we were adults. And understanding that while there were going to be things that were going to be upsetting to various people for various reasons, he wasn't going to try to sugarcoat it for us. He was going to actually meet us where we were. And that, I think, is something that has stuck with me for, 15 years now.
I think a lot of us have probably had leaders like that and appreciated that kind of atmosphere, that honesty can grow on a team.
Part of the reason that we decided to do this episode was looking at a couple of classic examples of leadership and comparing those styles when we look at the historical exploration of Antarctica.
Yeah, I mean, this has been obviously an issue that's affected many a great Antarctica tale. I think when you look back into sort of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, there are definitely some leader profiles that you could compare and contrast. Very famously, there was Scott, who was racing Amundsen, Scott the Englishman, who was racing Amundsen, the Norwegian, to be the first to get to the South Pole. And then we also have the example of Ernest Shackleton and his journey to take people all the way across the continent and the different outcomes that those leaders had. Scott very famously was sort of a top-down hierarchical leader. He gave orders, people followed those orders, and it had a chain of command. He wasn't really known for being really genial or collegial with the people that he was working with, but that had worked for him on expeditions in the past. It was sort of the way that the British command structure was generally run, and he ran his leadership team in that way. And the outcome was that people on his expedition died. Not everybody who set out to get to the South Pole returned, including Scott himself. And so there's that example of leadership. And it's often contrasted with Shackleton's style of leadership, which very famously was more collegial. He encouraged people on his crew to make decisions in a different way. He really encouraged camaraderie, loyalty to the group. But he famously did not achieve his goals of Antarctica, of crossing Antarctica, but he also nobody died on his expeditions. And so these themes of sort of a top-down leadership versus a more, I guess, just sort of...
Shackleton would probably be considered a little more democratic in his style.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, those are just two sort of theories of leadership in Antarctica that a lot of people think about when they think about the work that's done on the ice.
Well, and you think about the idea of the mission and completion of the mission, but also the number one thing being safety. That's the number one mission and with whatever you're doing, right? And so in some ways it's like, okay, well, maybe Shackleton didn't actually technically cross Antarctica with his crew, but they were down there for like more than a year and no one died. And to me, that's like, they achieved something for sure.
Right.
It just wasn't exactly what they intended to achieve when they set out.
Absolutely. And they learned a lot about the continent in the process. So actually, not achieving the one sort of named star goal didn't mean that those expeditions weren't successful.
And so I think that that's an interesting thing to think about in terms of Antarctica now, is this idea that kind of the only constant is change. And I think that we see this throughout life. Things are always changing. This is, you can say business, work, whatever, but it's life, right? But still people will cling to the status quo depending on their ability to cope with change, their ability to perceive change. A great example of this was my first season going down to the ice. We did not have an icebreaker ready to go for the end of the season when we bring all this resupply vessel in. And so I had given up my apartment. I had said goodbye. I had everything packed. And I was getting these emails saying, we don't know if you're actually coming down because we really don't know how big the program is going to be this year until we can secure an icebreaker. And so it really got me, it basically like indoctrinated me into the program with like, hey, anything can change at any time. But I think that's actually something that really makes the program very strong because people are expecting change and some of them deal with it well.
The main feature of what happens in Antarctica is there's always something around the corner that could derail the entire plan. You had your example about the icebreaker. I know that happened when there were unexpected at the time government shutdowns back in the day, COVID itself and the program dealing with COVID. All of those things were totally out of left field for the leaders that we had. And they had to very quickly come up with some solutions that affected real people in real time. And I'm always in awe of the decision-making patterns and the way that people go about that in this program, because you're right. There's nothing if not change and surprise in Antarctica.
Yeah. And it's kind of blending. How do you blend the structure that we need to have in order to make it easy for people to know what to do with that appetite for change and that ability to go, oh yeah, things are going to change at any time. But here's how you get out of the building if there's a fire drill, or here's, having enough of the day-to-day really structured so that people can still do their jobs and they might not be happy. And actually probably a lot of times they won't be, frankly. And how could you be with certain of these things? But they have to be able to have those procedures or SOPs or whatever in place so that when this change comes, the program can weather it. And again, sometimes better, sometimes worse. I don't envy any of the folks that were, especially in the COVID stuff. I do not envy being in those leadership positions at that time. It would have been really challenging.
What do you think some of the characteristics of the best leaders that you've had on the ice in Antarctica have been? The people who do it most effectively, what are some of the characteristics they have?
I would say that a lot of them would, first of all, be relatable. I think actually that's one of the most important things in leadership is not necessarily I'm your best friend, but having that ability to have authority and be in charge, but still be relatable and still understand what your people's day-to-day lives are like is probably the number one characteristic that I really appreciate. How about you?
I mean, I think some of the better leaders that I've had have been really comfortable with flexibility and being able to sort of have comfort level to completely change situation. That's something that I have never been really great at. So I really admire the people who can sort of turn on a dime and inherit the next situation of circumstances and just kind of keep going forward.
It's like, this is the kind of uber dorky part of it, is that like, that's the challenge for them. That's the adventure for them. If they're really into leadership, if they really love that kind of challenge, not that they're like looking for it and, oh, let's change everything all the time. Because I have had leaders like that too. But I agree, like being able to be a navigator of change rather than a survivor or a victim of change. You can tell that from your leaders as well, like the way that they're talking about the change that's happening. Either they're too Pollyanna and trying to make it out like it's going to be the greatest thing ever, even though you can tell they actually don't believe in it, or they're complaining about it right along with you, depending on what level of authority they had to make that change. Those aren't really helpful either. So it's relatability and authenticity in leadership, I think, are really challenging because it's a fine line to walk. And especially authenticity, that was another thing that we were talking about was authenticity in a closed environment where, you're with this very small community of people for X amount of months. And in a leadership role, there is a certain level of professionalism. Obviously, everybody needs to be professional, but how do you have that relatability and that authenticity without being an oversharer, without being inappropriate, without burdening your employees with inappropriate information that's not really going to help them? That's really challenging. I think it's even more challenging on the ice.
I think it is too, because we do have that 24/7, everybody you work with is sort of your family. They're in your private time spaces too, all of the time. So I think, especially for leaders on the ice, that's a particular challenge that's not faced in sort of 9 to 5 daily work roles. You have to kind of be that example of a leader 100% of the time. It's not something that you're necessarily used to as a human who is used to being able to let off steam in private time.
That's exactly right. And it is a challenge because there are very few people that you can really be open about these types of challenges with, I would imagine, especially if you are higher up. And the higher up you chain, the worse this gets for people. And so it's kind of thinking about, like, for me, I think a lot about authenticity, and what a lot of people will be afraid of being authentic as a leader because they don't want to be oversharers. And we've all had that oversharing leader, right? That just, you're just like, why would you tell me this? I don't want to know. And also, I don't care. Right? I think that the biggest distinction that I've seen around the difference between being an oversharer and being authentic, especially in the leadership context, is if you're sharing your mistakes in an effort to help others learn in a very pointed and topical way, that is authenticity. But if you are oversharing, it's basically you're sharing hardships to try to gain pity. That's going to be that oversharing side of the coin. And that's the one to kind of, that's not just one to kind of avoid. You should avoid it. So it's kind of what people are trying to do is they're trying to build a relationship or fast track a relationship, not realizing that you actually can't do that. You have to walk your talk first, and then you can be authentic by sharing mistakes that will help the person versus let me tell you about how hard my life was and and now you should really trust me because I'm in charge. That doesn't really work. And even if it works for a little while, it usually falls apart. And I've definitely seen that happen down there quite a lot, actually. And it really affects people's ability to show up. I mean, you can call it executive presence or gravitas or whatever you want to call it, but walking your talk, it really it creates a barrier for them to be able to do that and set direction and really move the mission forward, because now people don't really even trust you on a very fundamental level.
Well, you were talking about, Cassa, the concept of self-leadership. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and there's a theory around that people use in therapy called parts therapy. And so the idea of it, though, I'm sure a lot of people can relate to, is this idea that we have different parts of ourselves that we use for different tasks or things that we're doing. And so there might be like a manager part. That's the part of me that makes a lot of lists. Or there might be like the wounded child part or something, right? So there's also the part of ourself that is just the core essence of us. It's like, this is me. This is that best version of me. When I'm showing up and just really rocking and things are happening the way I want them to happen, and I'm really being who who I want to be. That's that self. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So when you're leading the self, it's coming from that place and really tapping into that place as you're making decisions about what you're doing. And this actually comes right back to the point of this episode, which is how do you lead yourself into adventures? If you're trying to create little adventures for yourself or big adventures for yourself, you have to actually lead yourself in that way. Nobody is going to go, oh, now it's time for you to apply for the blah, 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 or now it's time for you to get your passport renewed.
That's
you
right.
lead yourself, right? And so it's one of those things that I get it. I don't want to make people feel like they have to be there. I'm trying to advocate, fractured personalities or something like this. That's not at all the case. It's more tapping into that highest version of yourself so that you can make decisions from there.
When you're nurturing an adventure in your heart, it takes a little bit of planning sometimes to get to that adventure. So it's almost as if you have to do your own sort of project management, get your plan in place, put some steps in front of you to get to where you want to go.
Yeah, exactly. And it's starting with like self-awareness. So understanding like, well, what is that best version of me that I could make this decision from? And what would they say or what would they do? And sometimes it just helps to get that kind of perspective to help you see that. And then that builds confidence and self-belief. And then the outer game, which is action, right? So that's influence and impact. So what kind of situation am I creating and what impact is it having? So again, this is within leadership, the context of leadership and understanding how the way that you lead yourself will absolutely influence how others think of you and how the impact that you're creating really has a ripple effect throughout the community. And this is actually what we were talking about earlier, which was someone who might not be in a technical leadership role or like, I'm the Lord of the Manor or whatever, is still a leader because of that self-leadership.
And in some senses, none of us can really escape because we are often observed by the people around us. None of us really can escape the reality of needing to do some self-leadership, even if we're not a leader in a named leadership role, or even if we don't have people who we're directly supervising. Because we're a person on this earth and we're observed people, self-leadership is important.
Well, I mean, essentially, it's integrity, right? It's just walking your talk. I create an idea of myself, and that idea of myself matches how I'm operating in the world, and vice versa, right? Like we can see that we have congruence between our actions and our thoughts and our intentions. And the way that I see this show up for a lot of people too, and for myself, I mean, whenever I'm saying a lot of people, I mean me. Like this is absolutely something that I've always been dealing with and still dealing with. Is this should? I should do that. I call it the shouldy version of yourself. I should do this, or I should do that, or this should have been better. Anything like this. When you're leading the self, you can still use that to help raise standards, and that would be good. Whenever people are really falling into not leading themselves, it's because they're either having comparison, having the shouldy vision of themselves, and that really affects their ability to tap into that. So, we also talked about having jobs without clear bosses. So some of these roles, there might not actually be somebody who's officially in charge. You can either just sit on your duff and kind of go, whoa, nobody told me to do that. Or you can kind of go, what do I want to see around here? What is my vision for this? How do I make that happen? And, lead from behind, basically.
Yeah. And I think all of these things we're talking about, they do come into play as we make decisions in Antarctica about what the business of the day is going to be.
And I think, thinking about how you lead yourself, what leadership style you want to use, or what your real goals are with any leadership that you take on. So for example, like when we went back to Scott and Shackleton, they both had mission goals, right? But I think that Shackleton's ability to be adaptable and take in information, still being a leader, still being the final decision maker, still understanding different factors. I mean, I think that he succeeded more than Scott did, even though technically there wasn't, the outset of the mission was not achieved. If you were to just look at like, KPIs or whatever, it's like, yeah, okay, they didn't do it. But in my mind, I admire Shackleton a lot more because I think that he kept his team safe and he kept that higher version of himself in mind in order to lead this mission.
Yeah, the collective was valued instead of just the sentence dotted I's.
Yeah, exactly.
Cross T's.
Like that's the intent, right? Like what is the intent here? So yeah. So Keri, do you want to talk about the little penguin hop for this episode?
Yeah. I mean, I think that we, like we always do, we're just sort of giving you something to think about until we talk with you again. And today we want you to think about if you do any self-leadership. And if you do, when you think about the ways that you lead yourself, how can you lead yourself towards something that feels adventurous or exciting to you right now? It doesn't have to be a big thing, but can you muster your plan and muster your management of yourself into taking a step forward for yourself into what will be an exciting new reality? reality in your life. So that's what we're hoping that you'll do. Until the next time we talk to you, it's been great to hear from you guys. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Antarctica Did That For Me podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support our efforts, we would love it if you would tell your friends. And if you leave us a review on Spotify or Apple, it will help us find more of our fellow adventurers. We release a new episode every Tuesday, and we are a video and audio podcast, so you can watch or just listen. We're on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and more, or find everything, including links to our social media, at our website, antarcticadidthatforme.com. Thanks again for listening, and until next week, keep thinking about what opening your own heart to adventure could do for you.